Coming up.
Will Senate please come to order?
At the start of each session, the legislative crystal ball can be hard to read, but not to an increasingly skeptical public.
I don't think they're going to get anything done.
I think it will be an unfruitful session.
What are they going to do? Come back and say we're out of money, but we don't have a solution?
A solution likely to require lawmakers to tap permanent fund earnings to close the budget gap.
So we're going from an oil-dominated budget to a finance-dominated budget.
Ahead, Alaska at the crossroads of historic change. How this could affect you, your kids, and your grandkids.
Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers, with challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief that the best is yet to come. Bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to Frontiers. Last year, when the legislature adjourned, it seemed a lot like the final scene in that classic film, Gone with the Wind, when Rhett Butler delivers his Frankly speech, that line, "Frankly, my dear," and disappears into the mist. Then Scarlett rises up out of despair to say, "Tomorrow is another day." For the legislature, that new day is here and follows on the heels of last year's record 211-day session. For now, it's a fresh start and hope is in the air.
It's getting crisis level.
But those who watch from afar fear the future is just too hard to predict.
I would really hope that they can put their nose to the grindstone on this one.
I predict they're going to get something done, probably 60% chance in my view.
What do you see in the next 90 days?
I don't think they're going to get anything done.
And the worst case scenario?
It's over with. As far as the permanent fund is, it's gone.
Maybe not the permanent fund itself, but most likely some of the earnings. Almost 2 years ago, a citizens group created a game show to help us understand some of the options.
Round and round and round she goes. Where she stops, even OPEC doesn't know.
Bob Loeffler was the Alaska version of Vanna White, only this edition of Wheel of Fortune was designed to demonstrate the ups and downs of oil prices.
Oh, shoot. $50.
To show how we can no longer count on oil money alone to pay for government. Today, the stage props live here at the University of Alaska Anchorage.
And like all Alaskans, you're going, come 100, come 100, come 100, come 100. But in the real world, it won't happen.
Experts say don't gamble on seeing those kind of numbers for a long time. And while they've more than doubled since the price crashed, they fall billions short of what we need.
This is what we spend, about 4.4 billion, exclusive of the permanent fund dividend.
2/3 of our budget for this fiscal year came out of the state's main piggy bank.
And this is what we took out of savings this year. It was all from the Constitutional Budget Reserve.
Which is about empty.
I think that use of this model's changed. That is, right now, mathematically, we can't fill it with just this. There isn't enough.
So what now?
Each brick represents 100 million in this game.
The gold bricks represent about $15 billion in permanent fund earnings. Loeffler and Ralph Townsend, who heads up the Institute of Economic and Social Research, say that they're not psychics. The earnings are the next logical place to turn. So we do have the handy-dandy budget acts. How realistic is this as a tool?
There are two big areas of the budget. One is education and the other is healthcare and social services. And it's really hard to cut in those areas without really harming people, or in the case of education, shifting the costs onto local government.
Looking into the legislative crystal ball, why do you see that this will be the year that we will tap earnings?
63% of what we spend is we spend from savings. So if you imagine you're a family, and 2/3 of what you spend every day on food and healthcare and education is from savings. That's where we are now. And there isn't enough in the savings account we've been using, the Constitutional Budget Reserve. So mathematically, the only way to do it, It's to go to the earnings reserve.
So that is going to close a substantial part of the gap. Instead of facing a 2.5 billion, we're only facing $500 million, 500 million a year. How long can we get away with spending a little bit more than is really sustainable is the question.
But I almost hear both of you saying we can afford to coast for a while and not have an income tax.
There is one other thing I'd probably think about. There are probably some costs in the future that are going to come home to roost.
This year, out of all these $100 million bricks spent on state government, there was only one for the capital budget.
The capital budget has been cut to a bare minimum, $130 million, just enough to match the federal dollars. So we're not repairing schools, we're not repairing university buildings, we're not repairing the infrastructure for the state.
We also have some unpaid costs to the oil companies in terms of tax credits. And whether we pay them or not is sort of up to the legislature, but we've sort of promised them, and there are a number of people who think we should pay them. So there's that cost.
And money owed to the state pension fund. So these gold bricks could disappear quickly without some other source of cash. And one more thing to think about.
So we're going from an oil-dominated budget to a finance-dominated budget. And that's really part of what's historic.
So if we are moving to using earnings from investments more so than oil to pay our way, what are the risks?
As Alaskans, we're used to oil going up and down and up and down. And when it goes down, we're in trouble. But we don't realize that our financial well-being could do the same thing. So imagine if you had a financial crash and an oil price crash at the same time.
In other words, you would hit 3 lemons in the slot machine.
Exactly. So we're used to that slot machine we call oil taxes, but we also have to plan for that slot machine we call earnings.
Sooner or later, the state of Alaska has to impose a tax. The question is, what kind of a tax is it going to be?
But will lawmakers tackle that question this session?
I'm not very good at the crystal ball.
But that doesn't stop Alaskans from speculating.
I think it will be an unfruitful session, and I think there will be a lot of bickering among party lines.
It's always too long and over budget. Buffy, what do you see in the future?
Buffy says, unless it passes the smell test, no comment. Smart dog. But on a serious note, the bottom line for most Alaskans is probably whether they'll continue to get a permanent fund check if lawmakers tap those earnings. Larry Persily might be able to help us with that question. Over the years, he's worn a lot of different hats in Juneau. His perspective on the upcoming session when we come back. Governor Bill Walker laid out his roadmap for the session in his State of the State address this week. Overall, the governor played the role of Alaska's cheerleader-in-chief, but he did take lawmakers to task for their performance and told them other states finished their sessions on time, and there's no reason why they can't either. He's already proposed a plan to end their per diem at the end of 90 days and withhold salary until they get the job done. He's included penalties for himself if he fails to get his budget out on time. The governor also wants to move towards a biennial budget. He closed his speech by urging lawmakers to focus less on politics and the next election, but the greater good.
I'm taking the field this session and staying on the field until the session is done. And I ask that none of us remain in the locker room trying to keep our uniforms clean in hopes of being in the next year's pictures. Let's end the session on the field with the sweat and mud on our uniforms that comes from working hard every day for Alaskans. That's what Alaska's hired us to do. That they deserve nothing less.
Another big message, Walker told lawmakers the state's prosperity hinges on solving the state's chronic multi-billion-dollar deficits. And joining us now for a reaction to the governor's speech and the work ahead for the legislature, Larry Persily, having worked for 3 governors and worked in so many other arenas in state and federal government. So how did the governor's speech strike you?
Well, Governor Walker's personable. He's certainly positive in the speech. Look, but it was much like everyone else's State of the State speech. You go through some history, you have some personal stories, you talk about all the positive accomplishments, and then you get into, but we have these problems. He talked about crime, rising healthcare costs, need for a fiscal plan. So
it's his laundry list.
Right, but every governor does the laundry list at State of the State. As a former reporter, I dreaded going to State of the State and listening to the laundry list. And it's not a personal attack, it's just, close my eyes, haven't I been here before?
But the reference to election year politics, how serious of an obstacle is that this year?
I guess, are politics an obstacle to getting anything done in Alaska or the United States? Of course they are. Should we all talk about how they shouldn't be? Yes, we should talk about it, but they're going to be an obstacle.
This speech sounded pretty much like his campaign platform.
Well, he is up for re-election this year, and he's running for re-election this year, as is most of the legislature. So everything, well, I shouldn't say everything, much of what the legislature says is going to be couched in, I'm on the election ballot this year. That's the system we have. Sometimes it works very well. Sometimes, without getting into debate, and you look at national politics, it doesn't work so well. But that's the system we have. Everyone's campaigning pretty much nonstop anymore.
And so that might affect how the votes go on some of these things. Let's talk a little bit about the budget gap, because, you know, alone without an election year, these are things, you know, that cause tension. You know, they're real struggles, like having, again, a multi-billion-dollar budget gap for the next fiscal year to deal with. $2.7 billion.
Yeah, and this, so we're talking about the fiscal year 2019 budget that starts July 1. That will be the 6th year in a row with a budget gap where we're taking money out of savings, but people think, oh my God, this is just a new problem. We have been taking money out of savings to pay for education and roads and troopers and public services for more than half of the past quarter century. This isn't anything new. Any Alaskan who says, where'd this come from, hasn't been paying attention. They've been cashing their permanent fund dividend and not paying attention for the last 25 years.
Well, a few years ago, you know, we hit this peak in oil prices, and so the constitutional budget reserve got fattened up. But now look at it. It's down to $2.2 billion. And one of the things we showed earlier in the show was this game show, and you were on the stage when Alaska Common Ground did it. It was just a couple of years ago. And, you know, we had a lot of those white bricks, the CBR funds.
Taking money out of savings.
But we had a lot of them stacked up. I mean, how much have we drained that?
Well, so the Constitutional Budget Reserve was created by voters, constitutional amendment, in 1990. Since then, since it was created, more than half the time we've dipped into it. There was that period in the late 2000s where oil prices were high and we replenished it. But the fund has been down to couple $2 billion before. That's where they expect to end it now. But in these past 5 years, it looks like the state will have withdrawn $14 billion from its savings accounts to cover the budget. And you're right, those were the white bricks in that game, and they're just about gone, other than the permanent fund.
So let's talk about the permanent fund. We have some numbers here.
Is that allowed? You're
on this
in trouble.
Show, this show it's allowed.
You're talking about the permanent fund. That's it. You're never running for office.
Well, I don't think I could stomach it. You know, I don't understand how they do it. But $16 billion in the reserve account. This is that's the interest.
Right. Well, that's the earnings separate from the principal. That's one estimate as to how much will be there when the fiscal year ends June 30.
Now, for all the time since the permanent fund was created, the dividends have come out of the earnings account, not the corpus.
Correct.
And, you know, in recent years, the earnings have been reduced so that fund could kind of hold steady. But
well, the dividends have been reduced. The governor and the legislature the last couple of years said, let's not pay out the full dividend, leave some money in the earnings for when we need it.
But so bottom line, I think people will be wondering in all of this is, how is this going to affect my dividend check? I mean...
Right, that's the Alaskan outlook on everything, isn't it, right? How's it going to affect my dividend? The hell with the school next door. Sorry, as you say, I get cranky on this stuff. Look, I failed calculus in college, but I passed algebra. There is enough money in the permanent fund earnings. The permanent fund earns enough money to help pay for public services and have a dividend, $1,000, $1,200, give or take a year. You still got a little gap. That's why some people talk about taxes. And that can go on for a long time. You can have a dividend, public services, life can be good. If you don't want a tax of any kind at any point, you're going to have to take all the earnings from the permanent fund and probably not have a dividend. But some people would say that's fine. Use the earnings, no tax, rather than a small tax and a dividend and some earnings for government. And that's the political debate we're in.
Well, let's look at the price of oil, because it keeps inching upwards. It's come a long ways back from the Parnell administration at the end when it, and then when Walker took office at, in the $30 a barrel range. So it's edging close to $70 a barrel now.
Right, and at some point it'll edge back down. There is no law of the universe that says it's never going to fall down again. So people who say, oh, we're okay, but oil at some point in the future will dip in price. It always has. It will. It's just a commodity. It goes up and down. So if you do nothing and then the year comes along where instead of 70 or 65, it's back in the 40s and you got a huge deficit, you don't have enough in your earnings reserve of the permanent fund to cover that and the dividend public services. You can't start a tax on a Monday and cash the first check on Tuesday. We need to plan ahead, think ahead, and be reasonable and not just hope for the best.
So we've bought a little time if we tap the earnings this year.
We're going to have to use some of the earnings this year. There's just not enough left in the constitutional budget reserve. The question is long term, do you want a dividend and use some of the earnings for government and a tax to fill in the gap? Then you could also get into the argument that we should have some sort of broad-based tax in Alaska.
Well, the governor has a proposal. Here's his plan. He wants what's called a payroll tax. And I guess the quick question is, a rose by any other name would still be a rose, Shakespeare said. Is this a income tax in disguise?
Well, not really an income tax when you think on the federal sense. Taxes all your income, earned income, contractor's income, investment income, rental income. What the governor is proposing is a tax only on your earned income. So if you are someone who's living off your investments, retiree, so the tax would not apply to you. So it's really a payroll tax or a wage tax.
So we also have oil tax credits that we have to pay off. And the governor has a plan for that. He wants to issue bonds to pay this off.
Right. The state, by this summer, it's estimated will owe almost $900 million to investors, oil and gas companies that had taken the enticement, accepted the invitation, came up here and explored whether they found oil, whether they're producing oil. That wasn't part of the deal. You explore, you get a tax credit, you turn that IOU in, the state gives a check back. The governor's saying that's bad for business, makes us look terrible in the investment community. We've been paying off a little bit each year, but it's going to take a long time unless we find a way to come up with the $900 million. Governor's saying, let's negotiate a reduced payment on those IOUs.
Is that a good idea to do that, to kind of get this taken care of?
It is. We need to take, in the investment community, in the industry that of those smaller companies. We're not talking Exxon, BP, Conoco here. We're talking smaller companies. The fact that the state said, come work in Alaska, we'll give tax credits. Gee, money's tight. We can't give you those tax credits. We can't pay those IOUs like we led you to believe we're going to pay them. I think it's a good idea. See if you can negotiate a discount, borrow the money, stretch out the payments over several years so you can afford it and get this past us, because the legislature has ended those credits. These are the ones that accumulated before they ended the program.
Well, we've given you a lot of numbers, but one of the things that we say or we hear is that 21 and 11, the number that it takes to pass a bill in each house is really the key number.
It is. You're right. 40-member House, 20-member Senate. You need the majority. That's tough to get there. It's tough in an election year, but also it's not just the 21-11. It's getting the permission to accept the public to accept the reality. We got to do something.
And that always comes down to that. Well, thank you very much.
Anytime.
Well, coming up, if you yearn For the days before big budgets, big headaches, there was a simpler time back when Anchorage was small and George Brown started the Lucky Wishbone.
Every time I come in, I always collected a hug from George.
How customers remember George Brown and what his restaurant represents. The Lucky Wishbone is one of those deliciously Alaskan places, not just for the food, but for its rich history. George Brown, who died just a week after his 96th birthday, was a big part of that. He came to work almost every day for 60 years to run his restaurant. And as Lauren Maxwell shows us, you could find him sitting at his favorite spot at the counter.
On a weekday morning, workers at the Lucky Wishbone are busy, frying up fresh chicken, serving burgers to the crowd. But this morning, there's something missing. It's the man who would be sitting in this chair.
This was his spot. Every day, about 10:30 to 11, he would roll in.
George Brown was a fixture in the restaurant he and his late wife Peggy opened in 1955. In his later years, he spent hours at the counter, chatting with customers and never forgetting to leave a tip.
Even though he owned the business, he would leave a $5 tip.
He would.
Brown had a reputation for treating employees like family and customers like friends.
It's just a good place to go.
People like Annabelle Stevens, a regular,
47 years.
who kept coming back.
Every time I come in, I always collected a hug from George. When Peggy was here, got a hug from her too.
George's daughter Pat has been collecting condolences, including a personal note on the morning paper.
It says, sorry to hear about George. He was a great man and boss. 77 through 78 to me, Dave and Robin.
She describes her dad, a former World War II pilot, as a man of action.
He proposed to my mom on their first date.
Who took chances, like deciding in 1991 that the restaurant would go smoke-free.
Mom was so worried. She thought they were going to lose customers, they were going to lose their employees, and it went the other way.
Pat says one of the reasons for the Wishbone's success is that her father kept things simple and predictable, something that his customers still appreciate today.
When I ask people what's changed, they say not much.
Not much, not much. The food's still great. The same people come here for lunch every day for 50 years.
It's the way her father would have wanted it.
He left with no regrets, and he left with nothing unfinished.
She says the best way to honor his legacy is to make sure the restaurant stays the same. Reporting for Frontiers, I'm Lauren Maxwell.
You can say your goodbyes to George Brown at his memorial on Sunday, February 11th. It'll be held at the Alaska Aviation Museum starting at 2 in the afternoon. A lot of great stories will probably be shared. One programming note, Frontiers will be off next week, preempted by the 60th Annual Grammy Awards, but we'll be back on schedule the following week. Thank you for joining us. We leave you now with a musical show put on by nature. Joni Baker sent us this video from the confluence of the Kenai and Moose Rivers. Enjoy.